Welcome, everybody, to our presentation on mapping access globally. This is the kickoff to a project that was delayed for the COVID pandemic, so we're excited to get this off and running now on universal secondary education in the Asia Pacific. So my name is William C. Smith. I'm the project lead, and I'll be presenting today with Antonia Voigt, who is our research assistant for the project. As you're following along, if you'd like to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag #CID research group, as this is a CID research group event, or you can follow us on Twitter at @MorayHouseCID. All right, so off we go. So let's start by talking about the project. This is the kickoff for the project, but why are we doing it? So our project on universal secondary education in the Asia Pacific is partially motivated by the SDGs. So the SDGs came forth in 2015, where all countries signed off on the next round of Sustainable Development Goals. That included a Global Goal for Education, SDG 4, which has 10 targets to it and 43 indicators. What SDG 4 did, compared to the prior Millennium Development Goals, was really expand the focus of education globally from a primary education focus to lifelong learning. And that included very specific indicators for secondary education. So while we saw good growth from 2000 to 2015 in access to primary education, we're now trying to extend that by pushing the school year out to lower and upper secondary. So we can see in SDG 4, the indicators 4.1.4 focus on primary, lower, and upper secondary completion rate, and 4.1.5 focus on primary, lower, and upper secondary out of school rates. The idea that all of those are being increased substantially to 2030. We've got a long ways to go still, though. When you look at out of school populations, we see in 2019, looking at lower and upper secondary, nearly 200 million secondary age children and youth remained out of school around the world. And within the Asia Pacific region, over 1 out of 2 of those out of school children were found in the Asia Pacific region. So 55% of all out of school children and lower and upper secondary are in the Asia Pacific region. So there's obviously a need for this, but there's an additional need for the attention given the focus and the shift in discourse from the MDGs to the SDGs, from quantity to what they talk about as quality, which is really focused attention on the learning crisis as a lack of learning within school. And that shifted the attention to those that are in school and somewhat to the neglect of those that remain out of school. So we're questioning, are we really forgetting about those that haven't made it through the door yet? This project is a GCRF-funded project that brings together academics and non-academic partners, including international organizations and civil society networks, to explore how countries and communities in the Asia-Pacific region can best respond to the SDG 4 requirement of universal secondary education. So we have a great range of partners in this, including many that are joining us today, including partners from UNESCO's Bangkok office, the National Research Institute in Papua New Guinea, the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education, the Mongolian Education Alliance, the BRAC Institute for Educational Development, and many of my colleagues at the University of Edinburgh. So we're just getting this started. Within this project, we're looking at 3 research questions. So first, how are countries in the Asia Pacific region adapting to assure that universal secondary education specifically is met? What are the political, cultural, structural, and economic barriers to universal secondary education in the Asia Pacific region? And importantly, how do the barriers to secondary education intersect to further disadvantage marginalized groups in the region? So today at our project kickoff, we'll be doing 2 things mainly. What we're doing here is mainly sharing the draft framing for the larger study. So this will become the introduction chapter to the larger study and be followed by country-specific case studies that will be guided by the framing that we're going to outline today. So Antonia will start by providing an overview of access, kind of globally, regionally, and within the Asia Pacific, with a focus on completion rates. I'll then come back and talk about our preliminary barrier framework that might help guide the case studies. As this is a work in progress, we're encouraging constructive feedback. This is an early stage conversation with all of you. So we'd love feedback on focus areas, on different barriers, on how we're framing this, what we are doing well, what we still need to focus on, are we missing things? So it's very much designed as a constructive conversation after the presentation. All right, with that introduction out of the way, I want to turn it over to Antonia to get us started with the overview of access globally.
All right, hi everyone. So I will be looking at the current state of access to secondary education. There are 4 key questions that I hope will guide the section. Firstly, what are the best indicators to measure access to secondary education? How does it look across the globe, and more specifically in the Asia Pacific region? And finally, the question that is probably most interesting to us is, can we reach universal access to secondary education in the Asia Pacific region by the end of the SDGs in 2030? So, like Will already mentioned, we'll first look at it globally, then regionally, then Asia Pacific. And then within Asia Pacific, we're looking at the low and lower middle income economies. Ideally, or the presentation is structured based on patterns of wealth, gender, and trends. So the main categories of indicators commonly used to measure access to education are attendance rates, completion rates, enrollment, learning outcomes, out of school rates, and repetition. And these indicators can be broken further down by looking at variables such as ethnicity, gender, location, religion, and wealth. In theory, these indicators could give us a very good idea of the state of access to secondary education. However, in reality, that doesn't always look like that, because not all nations necessarily collect all of these indicators and variables to a variety of factors, from geopolitical conflict to political ideologies, development priorities, and of course costs associated with collecting this data. And even if the data is collected, international bodies such as the World Bank or UIS don't necessarily get access to the data, or the definitions used by the countries and the World Bank don't necessarily match, making it more difficult for World Bank to collect and collate the data for the world. So we're just going to be looking at completion rates because we don't have a lot of time, and largely the trends across one indicator mirror the trends across other indicators. So just for illustrative purposes, we're looking at completion rates. So across the world, our completion rates for lower secondary are around 70%, and for upper secondary, we're at around 50%. This is the 2015 completion rate. Since then, they haven't significantly moved. But as we can see from the map, the data that we do have is quite patchy and not necessarily representative for all geographic regions. We can see that there is an overlap with the global south or global north line. So, for example, Europe and Central Asia have quite high rates. So those are the darker green colors, while some global south countries in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa in particular, have lighter green colors, which represent lower completion rates for lower secondary. On average, most global South countries are below the global average, while most global North countries, which do provide data, are above the global average. If we then taking another perspective, if we look at the income strength of economies, we can also see quite a range of completion rates. So this is again focusing only on lower secondary. The difference between low income economies, which is this sort of light orange color at 33%, and we compare it to high income economies right at the top with 95%, we can see a gap of over 60%. So our high income, upper middle income, and lower middle income economies are above the world average, which is 72, while low income economies are quite below the global average. Over the past 2 decades, the lower middle income, which is the orange color, has made the biggest improvement from starting just above 50 to surpassing the world average to almost 74%, which does present a quite varied picture across different economy strengths. If we then look a bit more closely at the different regions in the world, we can again see quite a difference. So most global North and wealthier regions like Europe and Central Asia, as well as North America, are having completion rates for lower and upper secondary, which are above 80%, again, above the global average, which we can see on the left, while there is a quite comfortable middle region for the areas of Asia Pacific, Latin America, Caribbean, and North Africa and the Middle East, while Sub-Saharan Africa tends in most cases to always be right at the bottom of the completion rates, but also other indicators not managing to reach the global average rates at all. Asia Pacific, our main focus, is usually in the middle, sometimes above Latin America and Caribbean, and sometimes at the top of the middle region, of the middle bracket. If we now look only at Asia Pacific, and we again look at different income economies, so if we group them into low and lower middle, which is group 1, and then group 2, upper middle and high income economies, we can see that different levels of completion rates exist for both lower and upper secondary schools. So in group 1, for example, our lowest and highest level are almost 60% apart again, which reflects similar trends as we saw in the green world map. And if we then compare that to group 2, the lowest and the highest are actually not that far apart, with 83 to 91%, which are both above the world average of 72. So even within one region, there are very big differences in completion rates and economy strengths. Similarly, for upper secondary, it's the same idea, that the lowest and the highest for group 1 are quite far apart, with 17 to 78%, while for group 2, they're quite similar, with varying from 40% to 57%. One should note that these numbers, especially for group 2, are not necessarily representative. For group 2, only 3 countries have provided statistics which out of almost 12 countries. So it's not really representative. And high income economies like Australia or New Zealand, who have significantly higher completion rates for upper secondary, aren't in this graph. So if we want to see more closely how it looks within countries and try to identify patterns of trends and gender, there are three sets of trends and gender. So the first one is represented by Nepal in this case, which has experienced a quite rapid rise over the past 2 decades in terms of completion rates, only for lower secondary in this case, with male students always having higher completion rates than females. In contrast, we have countries like Mongolia, who have experienced a fairly steady rise over the past 2 decades. So the first half of the 21st century, they had quite a rapid rise, but it averages out as a steady rise. And in this case, just like for Nepal, male, which is always the solid line, start lower, and females, the dotted line, are above, even though in both cases, Mongolia and Nepal, the gender gap is closing. There is no, the female and the male line are always separate. One is higher and the other one is lower. The slightly more uncommon case is represented in this case by Vietnam, which is slightly more difficult to see, but if you look closely, the green line, Vietnam, at the beginning of 2000, females are lower than male. As time progresses, the age gap, the gender gap closes. However, by almost 2010, females have surpassed male in terms of completion rates, and the gender gap is actually increasing again. And Vietnam represents a slow rise in completion rates. So 3 sets of trends and 3 sets of gender are quite common. These particular ones are quite common across low and lower middle income economies, evenly spread across upper and lower secondary schools, with 10% in both types of secondary schools being quite rapid, a fourth being steady, and a few being slow. Again, the important part to note is that more than half so 11 out of 20 countries don't provide any data, or not enough data, to identify the trends that they have been experiencing over the past 2 decades. So the big question is, do these trends, are they enough to reach the universal access to secondary education goal? I'm happy to say that potentially for some countries it may be enough, but for most countries it's probably not enough, as we can see in this graph. I took Cambodia and the Philippines as an example because they sit on quite opposite sides of the spectrums in terms of development or expansion of access to secondary education. Cambodia is characterized by very rapid trend lines across most indicators, while the Philippines is characterized by slow expansion of access to secondary education. However, as we can see, even though Cambodia is quite rapidly expanding its access, it's probably not going to manage its 2030 universal access goals, but finish just under 50% in terms of completion rates, of course, while the Philippines, who have the advantage of starting in 2000 a lot higher than Cambodia, if they continue on the trajectory that they started out on, they may potentially achieve the SDG goal of access or of completion rates. So what can we conclude from all this data? The main point to remember is that the data is quite patchy and incomplete, so making projections for the future is not easy, or generalizing across regions. There is some alignment with the global north, global south line, and by strength of economies. Within the world, Asia Pacific sits in the middle, with Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the MENA region. And for Asia Pacific, we're looking at just as patchy and incomplete data. As we remember from the previous table, about 50% of countries don't provide enough data. There are some patterns of wealth which align with higher and lower access to secondary education rates, with, again, several countries not providing data. Within the low and lower middle income economies, the group in itself is moving in the right direction, expansion. There are patterns of gender where the male is always higher, or the female is always higher, or females start off lower and then finish higher, as in finish in 2020. And there are three types of trends: the rapid, the slow, and the steady. However, even the rapid don't necessarily provide enough to reach our SDG 2030 goals. Well, I think that's it for me.
All right. Thank you, Antonia. So for a wonderful overview of what completion rates, especially in lower secondary, look like within the region. And it's clear from the data that we've got quite a ways to go. So the aim of this project is to try to figure out, well, what barriers are in place, what needs to be overcome for us to be successful in providing universal access and ideally completion for secondary education for everyone in the region. And to start with this, once again, this is a preliminary framework for understanding the barriers to access in this region. We start by identifying four very broad barrier categories, and it's important to recognize that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive categories. So what we're going to try to do in this section of the presentation is just walk through the different potential barriers to access. This is the global level, and that we're using to think about a framework that we can apply within the region. This is quite an interesting task. So the first thing we did was look through the literature on all the different barriers, and as in creating any typology, identifying boundaries around categories is always difficult. So I want to share what we've come up with, and hopefully you'll have a chance to feed back into it. Okay, starting with political barriers to access. So there's a lot of other barrier categories or subcategories, synonyms that fit into each of these kind of barrier types. For political barriers, oftentimes this is talked about as legal or regulatory or administrative or bureaucratic barriers. And we can think about this separated into two pieces. We can think about kind of the political or the political economic environment, and we can think about specific laws and even education laws and policies in place here. Some specific examples to political barriers might be government investment in education, so spending less as a percent of GDP or less as a percent of government expenditure, so below that 15 to 20% that is expected of governments to spend as a percent of government expenditure on their education. So we have insufficient investment in education. We could have government-sanctioned discrimination and violence, and that could be implicit or explicit. And we have things like right to education laws. And those are just three of many examples of potential political barriers. that could be important within the region. And that's what we'll be doing, is exploring what specific political barriers are important for our countries that are being researched. But to give an example of the right to education, let me see if I can. So this is from the 2017-18 Global Education Monitoring Report, where we hired the Right to Education Project to do an overview of countries and their legal requirements in the right to education. Here we can see that basically 100% of countries out of the 196 explored have legally ratified an international treaty guaranteeing the right to education. Only 82% of those countries then included the right to education explicitly in their constitution. But the important part here is whether or not the right to education is justiciable in the Constitution. So a justiciable right means that the citizens within that country have the legal right to take the government to court for violating their rights. And we can see that even though 100% of countries have ratified a treaty guaranteeing the right to education, only 55% of countries provide that legal ability to take the government to court for violating the right to education. So we can see in many countries a very weak legal system that might create a barrier to access for some to education. Okay, economic barriers to access are oftentimes talked about as socioeconomic barriers, and you could think about things like opportunity cost here, which would be an indirect cost, compared to direct costs such as school fees. Some examples here are the distance to school. Distance to school oftentimes is related to transportation cost, but also has other concerns like security concerns in many countries. You might have the corruption of local officials taking bribes to entrance into schools. And you have school fees, not just for enrollment, but also additional school fees on exam fees, uniforms, meals, that add up to create a barrier for many families. So here on the left, we have one of my favorite articles looking at school fees. So this is Iskin et al. 2015, and they are looking at school fees in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, doing kind of a historical analysis. And there's a lot going on here. So if you're interested in kind of the political and historical relationship with school fees, I would encourage you to look at their article. But importantly, I want you to look at the blue line here in the middle of it, which has a steep acceleration right after 1990. And we see that the blue line represents enrollment in primary. So here they're looking at the relationship between primary school enrollment and school fees. And they make very clear, looking historically, that once school fees are abolished in the 4 countries they're looking at, it tends to follow with a very sharp rise in enrollment. Now, it may not follow with a sharp rise in investment in education, which is another issue by itself, but abolishing school fees does seem to provide initial access to education. So we see just after 1990, 1991, the abolition of school fees in Malawi, which is this vertical line in the middle of the graph. Right after that, we see this really sharp increase in the blue line, which is the enrollment in primary education. So there is an association between school fees and enrollment in education. And most of the research focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, but it doesn't mean that school fees are absent in the Asia Pacific. So on the right, we have a recent article by Deng and colleagues who's looking at school fees in China. And here we see, yes, school fees are there. You have tuition fees plus the other fees, right? And so those, once again, could be exam fees, transportation fees, school meals, and so forth. And what they're doing in this article is they're looking at school fees and access specifically to migrant students. So in China, there's a pattern of migrant students often coming to the city to gain access to education. And what they're doing here is showing that, yes, school fees sometimes are higher for migrants, sometimes are higher for urban residents. But the presence of school fees has a larger impact on whether or not migrants are going to actually migrate and access those schools. So oftentimes this is a prohibitive piece that prevents even the initial journey to access education for migrants in China. So obviously some major economic barriers that may be important to help us understand why access isn't universal yet in the Asia Pacific region. Other types of barriers could be structural barriers. These are systemic barriers, and we could think about things like biased curriculum, okay, which either in the text or in the illustrations themselves might demonstrate a very gendered nature and with traditional gender roles. It might be a lack of trained teachers, or something like primary school exit exams. So one of the challenges that we're seeing and kind of throughout the world is for a long time compulsory education ended at the end of primary education. And many countries had an exit exam at the end of primary education to provide some students the option to go to the next step in education. Well, as we're expanding the notion of compulsory education and pushing education further and further out, these primary school exit exams can act as a barrier to secondary education. So a couple of examples of that. On the left, we have primary school exit exams in Uganda, in Tanzania, and Kenya. So and on this is the percentage of failure. So the percentage of students that took the primary school exit or primary school leaving exam in those countries. I think this is 2014, 2015. Blue represent the percentage of females that failed that exam, and the orange represents the percentage of males that failed that exam. And we can see not just are we restricting access to secondary education for a large percentage of students, but that is disproportionately affecting access for females in these countries. Now, Uganda looks smaller than Tanzania and Kenya here. And that's because, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that Uganda and the effects of Uganda's primary school leaving exam are smaller than the other two countries. So in Uganda, you have a fail, and then the level right above a fail, if you fall into that category, also means that you do not have access to government secondary schools, which means you automatically, if you want to continue to secondary education, have to go to a private secondary school. So in 2014, over half of the students that took the primary school leaving exam were denied access to government secondary schools. And primary school leaving exams, again, are present in the Asia Pacific region. So in a review by Hill of 21 education systems in 2013, Hill found that over 3 of 4 had exit exams at the end of lower secondary, potentially prohibiting access to certain types of education in upper secondary. And 1 out of 3 still had an exit exam at the end of primary. So once again, an interesting structural barrier that potentially can have implications for access to secondary education. The final barrier category we've identified are cultural barriers to access. And these are sometimes called social cultural barriers and include linguistic barriers, language barriers, barriers based on religion. And examples here could be a preference for sending boys to schools. In some countries, the language of instruction can be a barrier, or within school bullying and harassment. So here, if we just look at bullying as an example, so on the upper left, we have bullying in over 80 countries based on the Global School Health Surveys by a recent article from BOAS, and we can see regionally that bullying at schools, this is individuals aged 12 to 15, is quite common. with some regions, so the Eastern Mediterranean and Africa, looking at close to 50% of students reporting some type of bullying in schools. And we see that Asia still is substantial, greater than 1 in 5 overall are identified as bullying. And to the right, so we can see European, the region of the Americas, and the Western Pacific, we actually see increased or greater amounts of bullying reported in the Western Pacific. When we look specifically at the Asia Pacific region, UNESCO Bangkok is broken down between bullying, those who are in a physical fight, and those who have been physically attacked in schools. And they say within Asia, just over 30% of students reported being bullied, and within the Pacific, almost 37% being bullied. We can see almost a quarter report in Asia being in a physical fight, and that's nearly 40% in the Pacific. And physically attacked is actually the highest rate here, where almost 33% of students in Asia report being physically attacked. And in the Pacific, nearly half of students reported being physically attacked at some point in school. So once again, another potential barrier to access that is obviously present in the Asia Pacific region. It's important to recognize, as I mentioned before, these are not mutually exclusive categories. That if you are affected by one barrier, you're actually more likely to be affected by other barriers. And to some extent, there's an acceleration effect here. So we can see that these are intersecting barriers that may have a detrimental effect on the most marginalized groups. Now, importantly, we don't want to come up with just a list of barriers. Right? The goal here is to lead towards some type of action that might help overcome the barriers. To do that, we can't come up with a list or even a list by categories. We need some additional information, because the additional information is going to help us understand what approaches we need, how long is it going to take to overcome that barrier, and what resources we need. So specifically, we need information on what level the barrier is at, and whether it's a formal barrier or something informal. And oftentimes the informal barriers are something that's going to take a little longer because they're culturally ingrained or embedded. So the next thing we're looking at is within these 4 barrier categories, what level are the barriers at? So when you look at the literature on barriers, oftentimes you have even a separate category called school-related barriers. Here we're putting school at the meso level, because we recognize that there can be structural barriers, there can be cultural barriers, there can be economic barriers in school. So we are, instead of creating a separate locational barrier, we're trying to identify barriers across the micro in the individual household, across the meso, within the school community, or at the macro level, nationally or internationally. And just for some examples, we can plot barriers onto this. So we can see, we talked about primary school leaving exams or exit exams before. We can identify that as a structural barrier at the national level, so at a macro level. And culturally, we've talked about sexual harassment or violence and bullying. And we can identify that as a cultural barrier, potentially, sexual harassment experienced in schools at the meso level, identifying it as a school level thing. Here, we've also tried to differentiate between that formal and informal. So in bold, we have a very formal barrier that is part of policy or law. And in italics, we have an informal barrier that tends to be more culturally embedded. Now, while typically we can think of informal barriers along this bottom cultural category, that's not always the case. And you don't just have formal barriers and informal barriers in a single category. So for instance, here, we can see that we have economic barriers, and some of them are formal and some of them are informal. So economic barriers, we've got school fees, which we talked about before. And a lot of times school fees differ at the school level. So we can think about generally school fees being a meso level barrier. But we also have household decisions that might provide preferential investment for boys or girls. And that's typically an informal barrier to education. It is an economic barrier, but it could also be a cultural barrier. So here in this example, we're able to see that formal and informal barriers aren't necessarily just on a single barrier category. They can happen within a barrier category like we see here with economics, and that barriers do transcend the categories here. It's one of the challenges with creating typologies. So here we've got household decisions and preferential investment in education being both an economic barrier and a cultural barrier. So from this table, once again, we're trying to go from listing barriers to finding a way to take action in the local community to overcome the barrier. So once we've identified this, we can take the barriers from this table and place them in the left side column here, where we've got, for example, the primary school exit exams and sexual harassment in schools as the two example barriers. And once we've identified the level and the nature of the barrier, we're better able to understand the potential approaches to that. We could think of kind of the general timing around it, and this is relative to each other. So we can think about, primary school exit exams. The approach or intervention might be to remove that exam or to replace it with, let's say, a sample-based assessment. One of the things that Uganda was considering. That this might take a while, but it can also be done fairly quickly, depending on the political will within the country. So you need that political will first, but there's additional funding and resources that are needed for secondary. Right. So if we remove the primary school exit exams, we'll probably see another wave of individuals coming to secondary, and we'll have the same issues we had when we removed the school fees in for primary and the massive enrollments we saw in the 1990s in parts of Africa. So and then with the removal or replacement of the exam, is that going to transition the exam to assessment instead of a census-based exam? Are we going to do a sample-based assessment? And will that involve changing the stakes of the exam, which might have its own issues? So for sexual harassment in schools, we can see that this is an informal barrier that oftentimes needs a prolonged community action and education campaign. At the same time, it might need to strengthen legal protections along with some type of school level education and training. As an informal barrier, it's expected to take longer to change cultural perspectives. And this needs to be potentially lead to a change in educational materials. We may need community organizers. We need political support for this type of change to overcome a barrier of this nature. So once again, trying to go from just listing the barrier to finding ways to take action on it. And this is the initial brainstorming that we can then from here identify, well, what are the key stakeholders that need to be brought into the conversation? Okay, finally, going back to intersecting barriers, this overlapping or intersecting barriers signifies that there's a more embedded challenge in the community. All right, so when we have barriers that we can see are both economic and cultural, or political and economic, or especially those that fit right in the middle of this Venn diagram, we expect that it's going to take more time to redress those barriers, and it's going to involve additional resources. So part of what we're doing here is also trying to identify, if we have limited resources, what can we effectively do within a community? Okay, so that gets us through our presentation. As I said, this is quite a formative piece here. So what we've done is just try to provide a general overview of access globally, regionally, within the Asia Pacific, and then an initial framework for how we're seeing barriers to ensure universal access to secondary education in the Asia Pacific region. So, yeah. So I think at this point, I want to open it up to questions, comments, feedback. I'll be frantically taking notes down. So if you've got ideas, ways to strengthen this, or any type of good feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks everybody for listening, and I think we'll open it to question and answers now. You can add those to the chat box, or I think we're a pretty small group, so just feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah, Shari.
Hi, Will, and hi, Antonia. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. I guess I have a question about motivation to go to school and the kind of complexity of that, I suppose. And I suppose I'm just bringing that up because I'm wondering if maybe it's just something to think about in terms of what the framework that you outline captures and what it may not capture in terms of intersections. So in terms of motivation, I guess I'm thinking, well, you know, what motivates an individual or what motivates a group of individuals living in a particular community to go to secondary school? So, I mean, I guess when we think about primary school, we think about primary school's purpose as, you know, children learning to read and write and getting sort of basic education. When we think about the purpose of secondary school, it's often tied in with gaining qualifications, getting a job, and in contexts where there are no jobs, for example, or, you know, the sort of post-school prospects are bleak, it's unlikely that there's going to be a high motivation to go to school. So that's one thing. Another thing is, at the start, you were talking about the kind of emphasis on the learning crisis and the quality of what's happening in classrooms. And again, I suppose I'm suggesting that that may also be related to whether or not people want to go to school, because what happens in the classroom may not be terribly interesting or motivating or useful for them in the lives that they're going to have. So I guess that there's just a couple of things sort of that I was thinking about as you were speaking, and based on my experience of the situation in the Marshall Islands, where, you know, these things are kind of important factors. And in that context, then you have also the big problem of migration, that actually education at that level often leads people to leave the country rather than stay in the country and be reinvested. But that's very particular to that situation. So anyway, there were just some thoughts that I had while you were speaking.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Shari. And that's a great start. Part of what we're trying to do here is just to get a sense of, you know, are we missing stuff? Does this framework make sense? Does it need to be tweaked some? Can it not capture some things? So the questions on motivation, I think that it can more easily capture the kind of economic motivation and economic barriers, but the quality of education, where does that fit neatly in here? You know, I think we can talk about certain pieces of it, but it's something that we'll have to rethink a little bit. Fatih?
Thanks, Will and Anthony, for sharing your research. It's very, very interesting, and I think my points are very similar to Shari's comments. I want to, like, access to education is one point, but also what's happening inside the classroom, quality of education. I mean, as moving forward, are you also planning to focus more on quality of education as well? I also want to hear more from you in terms of economical barriers, like especially I want to, I mean, if you have any chance to research in terms of tax issue, like inequality within the society. I mean, who pays tax if there's inequality in terms of funding the public education, right? So maybe students have access to primary secondary education, but, you know, in terms of infrastructure and available funding for the secondary education, whether or not there is any variance among the countries as well. Yeah, I will be very much interested in this tax issue as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Fatih. So, yeah, I think we're like I said, as a project team, I think we've had conversations on, not forgetting about quality and potentially following up with this for this project. So this is a GCRF funded project that is really a short-term piece to bring this network together. And so this is an initial scoping piece to get a sense of some of the questions you just asked about. So is issues with low levels of taxation and lack of government funding for education through taxes something that is present, especially in the country case studies we're looking at. So I think that we'll be trying to look at these barriers within the specific country level context. And I don't have the answer to that within those countries. I know that there's a lot of increasing information, especially being pushed, in my circle at least, being pushed by ActionAid, looking at taxation and education and public resources. So I think that we'll continue to explore not just who's paying, but who has the preponderance of the responsibility for payment for education. And that could include tax information. So yeah, but some good stuff. All right, other questions, comments, feedback, other specific barriers that in your area you really want to highlight? Yeah, Renee?
Yeah, well, in the case of the Philippines, we have surveys as well as administrative data that points to, the lack of personal interest, whatever that means, as one of the top reasons, it's always number one, number two, or number three in national surveys as well as in administrative data. So I guess this connects also to questions of motivation or the attraction of the school system. I mean, it might be a failure of the school system to make education, to make learning interesting, rather than to fault the learners or the students for having a lack of interest in education. So I think this needs further nuancing, but at the same time, where do you locate the lack of interest among learners? It may also be related to unfriendly environment in the school system that disadvantage them or discriminates them, and that leads to the loss of interest in education. Okay, so it intersects into the different barriers that you have identified. The other thing is related to teenage pregnancy or early marriage, which is very prevalent in South Asia and even in the Philippines. Again, teenage pregnancy has been identified in surveys in the Philippines as one of the top, either 1, 2, or 3 again, reasons for dropping out of especially secondary school. And so where do we locate early marriage, teenage pregnancy? This has some cultural implications because pregnancy is something like the fault of the girls, or culturally it should be the girls that should take care of the child rather than a common, a responsibility of both parents, and so it is the cause of dropout, especially among women, among young girls, but also a question of poverty in the sense that it is one mouth less to feed, and parents probably in poor areas, especially in South Asia, may have this reason to arrange for early marriage for girls, so that is something that really in the case of the Philippines, something to look at. Now, the third point that we also need to nuance is privatization of education. So often you will see, there are private schools, and so that should offer access to education. But there are also private tutoring services, and I think this is very pervasive in Asia. And I think Mark Bray has done a lot of studies related to private tutoring, and that is one way or a cause for those who are economically, in difficult circumstances to drop out of school because they cannot afford the high cost of tutoring. And if you don't do private tutoring, then you fall out from the school system. You get low grades, or you lose interest in learning, in education. But also privatization of education leads to inequity. Inequity because they charge fees, no? Even PPP schools, or public-private partnership, voucher schools, or contracting. Normally, in the case of the Philippines, and I think even most situations in South Asia also is a cause for inequity, in the sense that economically backward, those who are having difficulties economically could not afford to pay for tuition fees. But it's also a cultural thing, and a political decision because of investment, the lack of investments actually of government to provide for a strong quality public education, public school system, may be driving privatization of education. Yeah, so those points we need to really still nuance. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Renee. Really appreciate the examples coming from the Philippines, and looking forward to hearing that case study where these are fleshed out a little more. The privatization thing is interesting because I think that, that is kind of a transcendent piece when we think about how privatization is really part of, not just delivery, but you talked about private school or after school private tutoring. We think about the privatization of education services as well. Private textbooks, uniforms, so forth, and what that means for inequity. And I'm sure, since we are both well aware of this, that to some extent, I think that's the inequity that is the outcome of privatization is part of a lack of investment and political will in providing universal government-funded education in a country. But there's also, we see this in various countries, like a lack of government will or capacity to regulate private actors in the country. And so I think that's also an important thing to highlight is, okay, yes, sometimes you have the presence of private actors, but whether or not they're operating honorably, sometimes is determined by whether or not there's regulation in place, providing some guidelines. Fatih, I saw your hand back up. Did you want to come back in? Something?
Yeah, actually, it's very similar to what Renee was saying. And again, I will make connection to what Sherry was asking. What is the motivation of students, especially where there is a widespread practice of shadow education practices? I mean, even though students have access to public education, right, still teachers in the public schools are still practicing some private tutoring. So, I mean, that's another barrier, especially this is very common in the Cambodian context. I think Renee can talk more about the region. But I mean, for example, in Cambodia, access to public education is one struggle. But even though you access to public education, then students somehow feel obliged to take private tutoring to just catch up with others. That could be another structural barrier. So that shadow education practices or private tutoring is also like very interesting piece to investigate more. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fatih. I think when I was doing the initial kind of review of barriers and looking at like the example for a school fee, when I was looking for examples within the Asia Pacific, the most common example that I saw, at least the recent literature, was looking at school fees to teachers to provide private tutoring, and especially school fees to public teachers that were then providing private tutoring after hours. So, interesting.
Yeah, because I think sometimes, teachers in public schools, even they think that, they will teach later on privately, so they prefer the private part more, and that's a huge barrier in terms of quality of education. So if I have a poor background and I'm in the public school, and if I cannot afford that private tutoring, I'm already lagging behind. So they're very interesting, really.
Excellent. Thanks, Fatih. Other questions, comments, pieces of feedback, other barriers that you think are essential and need maybe more attention highlighting?
Can I ask Antonia a question?
Yes.
And this is just a kind of clarification point, and reveals my complete ignorance when it comes to anything to do with stats or anything like that. So I wondered with the information, the World Bank information about lower secondary and upper secondary, where the distinction between the two is made, and is it made kind of universally, or is it made depending on specific kind of countries? And why is that distinction made, I suppose? Is it to do with exams or?
So the World Bank, if I remember correctly, the World Bank differentiates between lower secondary and upper secondary based on age.
Okay.
So they say, for example, the long name for the lower, for example, for the completion rate of lower secondary would be completion rate of adolescent in lower secondary, or for upper secondary it would be completion rate of youth in upper secondary. But that, so they use the age as a cutoff date, and then they have a separate indicator for overaged children in lower secondary and upper secondary to distinguish between what you would consider average or normal completion rates and overaged completion rates.
And that's applied across contexts?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So it doesn't matter if in one particular country you have an exam in the middle of secondary, or that's not taken into consideration, it's just age. Okay.
Yeah, it's just age. Yeah, to sort of find a form of standardization across the countries.
Okay, I was just interested in that distinction. And then my second question again was, when you were talking, it was really interesting when you were talking about the gender discrepancies between different countries and the kind of the graphs that you were showing. I guess I was wondering if those there's always a gender discrepancy, it seems, and I just wondered if that was true also of the global north. And do we have any places where there is no gender discrepancy at all?
So when you look at the gender parity index, most global north countries are, so it's usually grouped into 3 female favored, gender neutral, and then male favored. And depending on where you set up the cutoff point, is it at 0.1, is it at 0.5, that it suddenly starts favoring male, or is it minus 0.5 that is where you start classifying it as favoring female? Most Central European countries are gender neutral.
Okay.
I remember that Germany, for example, had a few years where females were favored, but I don't think that's necessarily because of the country system, just maybe because of that a particular year had more females than males. North America is also quite gender neutral, and Central Asia is a mixture of gender neutral and favoring male and favoring female. I suppose it depends on culture and other economic and political areas.
Okay, thanks. It was just out of interest. I was just asking. Thanks, Antonia.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, the gender question is interesting because it was it's a mixed view on the end of the Millennium Development Goals. So the MDGs looked at access to primary education and gender parity at all levels. And depending on who you read at the end of 2015, some very much celebrate the gender parity because at certain levels of education, globally, on average, we had gender parity. But when you look within the countries, it's very rare that within country differences are neutral or not present. Antonia, I want to go back to Sherry's question a little bit. So I think it was around this slide where we've got completion rates. And I think what you're talking about with age has to do with the number over 100 here. Can you explain why we've got something over 100%? So you've got really dark green here on completion rates that say over 100%.
Yeah, the over 100 is because it accounts for, as the description at the top says, it's because of overaged and underaged children who enter school late or early or repeat years, and that's how you happen to have over 100% completion rates. If students who shouldn't be in the age, who aren't in the average age group, appear in the statistic for that age group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you might have 20-year-olds completing upper secondary or 18-year-olds completing lower secondary. Is that correct?
Yeah. In India, for example, has even though that's not in this particular year, India has quite an interesting high number of overaged students in lower secondary and upper secondary who are 15 to 24, for example. That's why you can have completion rates. You can have completion rates which are the normal age groups, and then you have completion rates for 15 to 25, for example, for upper secondary, which accounts for this overaged and underaged portion of students.
Okay. So one of the questions I've got, so we've got kind of an overage, which I think is often talked about as a gross enrollment rate and or gross completion rate, and then a net completion rate, which is within age. But when the World Bank is reporting completion rates and they say upper secondary or lower secondary, are they defining what is upper secondary, or is that defined by the countries? And they say, here's our upper secondary goes to year 9, for instance, and this should be this age. And for some countries, lower secondary might go to year 10. So do you know if the country is defining what their upper and lower secondary is, or is the World Bank defining that?
The World Bank is defining that as using a theoretical age of when you should start lower secondary and the theoretical age when you should be finishing lower secondary, starting upper secondary and finishing upper secondary. And that's why you have 2 types of completion rates. One which is using the theoretical ages, and then one which is counting for overaged and underaged children as a separate indicator.
Okay, thanks. Other questions, comments, feedback from everybody? Yeah, Jingyeon?
Hello. I just feel that I want to mention a point that can be looked at, which is stratification in especially the highly competitive society nowadays. Because I used to work in shadow education industry, that's why I witnessed a really astonishing gap among different families, especially in the big cities. And I think there's a really astonishing gap between the different families in society. And I believe that this kind of thing is actually causing people to change their views about education. For the families which actually have a lot of capitals in society, they start to think about how much value the public education can actually offer them, while for some other disadvantaged families, they start to feel that actually the stratification in society is really severe and actually kind of fixed, and they actually can't push their children, push their kids out of the level the social rank that they have. And I'm witness a lot of different opinions about actually the value of public education. So I think that maybe stratification is also a factor which can be looked at. I'm not sure, and I think maybe that has a bigger impact on more advanced education or higher education. But I believe that this kind of impact is kind of increasing in society. That's what I want to say.
Okay, thanks, Xian. Can you expand a little bit when you talk about stratification? All right, so some of it, the most easy thing we can talk about is kind of economic class stratification. But are there other things that when you think about stratification, you're thinking about countries or cultures that are stratified upon what? What are you thinking about underlies the stratification?
I think the most common concept that we are talking about is still economic stratification. In the past, especially maybe 20 or 30 years ago, most people believe that education is the only way that we can use to actually move to a higher rank in society. We can use that to change our destiny. But I think in recent years, there is an increasing trend which thinks that actually public education can no longer change the rank, change the social class people are in. That's why I think many people are actually shifting their orientation in their life, and they don't want their kids to be in the public education anymore, because that's actually doesn't change their social rank, their economic stratification anymore.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Xingyuan. Any other comments, bits of advice for us, things we can add or should look at?
Can I look again at the graph of the Philippines and Cambodia?
Yes.
Because yeah, this is completion rate for upper or all secondary.
It's the average between upper and lower secondary.
Yeah, because in the case of the Philippines, we have 4 years of education cycle at the secondary level up until 2016. So starting 2016 up, we have the 6-year secondary secondary cycle, 6 years cycle, and so that happened only during the last 4 or 5 years, So I was wondering how, on what basis this was computed, given the fact that we have only 5 years of experience having what we refer to us in the Philippines as the senior high school, or it may be the upper secondary, but it's only 2 years, in addition to what we usually have of only 4 years. So I may have to go back to this graph and this data. Okay.
Yeah, so I use the same lower and upper secondary completion rates for Cambodia and Philippines, which were again provided by the World Bank on the basis of age groups. The percentage of students in the theoretical age group for the lower and upper secondary. I can provide you with the statistics that I used for that and the definitions of the indicators, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that will help us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
So Renee, I've got a question on that. So when you talk about 2016, the Philippines shifting, are you saying that they've kind of added 2 years to the education, or are they just restructuring the full education cycle?
No, they actually added 2 years. No, it used to be that we have only 10 years of basic education, 6 years primary and 4 years secondary. And so we're about one of the last, no, to shift into a 12-year basic education cycle. And so it was only 2016 that we added 2 more years in the basic education cycle and added that as senior high school. So now secondary education is 6 years in the Philippines. So we have 12 years. The complete cycle would be 12 years.
Interesting. Do you know of the motivation? I mean, that's a pretty substantial change. Do you know of the motivation within the Philippines for adding 2 more years?
Yeah, it's because of to catch up with the rest of the world, no, and because we have problems of equivalency when our students in doing postgraduate in other countries would be evaluated, and you lack basic education, something like that, and so in order to catch up with the rest of the world, in order to be of standard, no. So we added there was a historical problem that we had. No, we used to have 11 years. Then they took out 1 year in order to add 2 years in secondary education in secondary school. But that never came. The law that would add up as another 2 years, no, to compensate for the deletion of 1 year in primary education did not come. And so we have these 10 years of basic education cycle during the post-Second World War years.
Thanks, Renee. It's very interesting. Thanks for sharing. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, if we don't have any other questions or comments, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. This is the first of multiple presentations and events that are part of the Universal Secondary Education in the Asia Pacific Project. The easiest way to follow along with us when we've got public events is either looking at our Eventbrite page where you registered for this event, or you can follow us on Twitter at MoreHouseCID, where we'll be advertising the upcoming events. That'll include presentations from Shari, who you heard from earlier, on education in the Marshall Islands, as well as a presentation on the role of digital education and access. And then this will all be culminating with our report on case studies, including the case study on the Philippines and in 4 other countries in the Asia Pacific region. So if you've got any additional feedback, I'd love to hear it. So you can email me. My email's on the screen now. Other than that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you are looking for references, they're there, and I will be sharing this PowerPoint out with all registered participants from Eventbrite, as well as the link to the video when we're all done. So thanks everyone for joining. If you've got any other questions, I can hang around for a minute or two. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day. So much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Will, can I just ask a quick question? If I've registered for this one, does that mean I'm registered for all of the presentations, or do I have to do that separately?
Unfortunately, you've got to do that separately.
Oh, okay.
So,
yeah. So okay. So I'll go and do that. I just got slightly confused.
Yeah,
so.
I don't have the registration up for the others yet.
Oh, okay. That's why. Okay, that'll be why. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So, thanks.
But I'll email. What I can do is I can email people that came to this presentation with the next one.
Okay, that's great. No, I think that because the next one's mine, I just thought I don't want to end up like not being able to attend.
No, we'll make sure.
I thought I'd missed something. Okay, thank you.
Yep.